Warmly welcome, everybody. Fantastic to see so many here, despite this early morning and chilly morning also. Winter is here, there's no escape, I fear. Welcome to the House of Europe. My name is Katarina Areskog Mascarenas. I'm the head of the EU representation here in Sweden, and we do seminars like this in order to explain and also to take in views on EU Commission's proposals. Our second task is to also report to Brussels and the EU Commission in Brussels what's going on in Sweden. Today's seminar is part of our discussion on the future of Europe. After the referendum in the UK, we started an internal discussion which resulted in a number of papers. First, the White Book we had the 1st of March this year, and 5 other reflection papers on different subjects from the EU budget, defense, social dimension, also the EMU deepening, and harnessing globalization. What are the effects of the globalization that we are seeing right now? And the purpose of this is, of course, to engage citizens all over Europe to discuss these issues and also take a position. What kind of Europe do we want? What should be decided on the EU level, and what is for member states to take care of themselves? And we've actually had 2,000 events bringing together around 270,000 participants in these discussions. And today we are extremely happy to have Kerstin Jorna with us, who is Deputy Director General in the Directorate for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission in Brussels. And Kerstin will give a first speech, and then we are equally very happy to have Oskar here, Oskar Stenström, who is State Secretary with EU Minister Ann Linde for Trade and EU Affairs. So I believe you will frame the discussions, and then we have 2 fantastic panels that my colleague Jens will introduce a little bit later to discuss your initial remarks. We also send this on Facebook Live, and if you thought it was such a fantastic experience, you want to experience it again, you can go to our website and see the dialogue again. You can also tweet here on our Twitter wall and post questions, and we will try to take them up. And it's hashtag Europahuset. But you can also, of course, in real life ask questions. We have microphones, so please wait for the microphone, because then also those that are listening to Facebook will hear your questions. My colleague Jens Mattisson, who is economic advisor in our representation, and Andreas Bergström, who is deputy director sitting here at Forest, the think tank Forest, who we are organizing this, I should mention, this seminar together with, will moderate today's discussions. And there I will stop and leave the word to Kerstin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katarina and Andreas. Are you awake? Because I'm going to challenge you now. I quote, "She speaks 8 languages, but mostly French, and that is as if she had been born in Paris. She knows more than all our academy and Sorbonne put together." Who is described here? Nobody? Queen Christina. 1629 to 1689. And I consider that nothing has changed a lot. Sweden is still very open to engage and exchange with other cultures, other ideas, trade around the world. Actually, 76% of Swedes think that globalization is a positive thing. And you're only beaten, I'm sorry to say that, by the Danes, who are even more enthusiastic about globalization. I've already had a number of discussions yesterday, and the 3 words I heard most, the 4, is small and open economy. That's what characterizes Sweden. And now the question is, how does the EU agenda fit into this? And this is how I see we should frame. Katharina presented the future approach that the Commission has launched with the white papers and why we are here. My role, together with my co-panelists, is to set the scene for our debate. What I'd like to focus on is three things: feelings, facts, and forward focus. If we could have the slide on perceptions. Wait, no, hang on. How does this? Voila. This is a slide about feelings about globalization. And what you can see is that 55% of EU citizens consider it an opportunity, 45% consider it as a threat overall. Pretty balanced. When it comes to confidence about the future and globalization, 65% see the economic prospects with confidence, 35% with anxiety. And when it comes to identity, only 37% see globalization as an asset, and Sweden certainly is part of this, and 53% see it more as a threat. Now, where does this anxiety come from? One thing is sure, that benefits of globalization are not shared evenly between regions and people. They are regions that consider themselves losers, and I'm traveling sometimes in other countries, and I see, and it's blamed on globalization, and also the inequalities, the divide between the most rich and the poor has grown in Europe. Europe is still the place where the most equal place in the world, but still 1% of the population holds more than a quarter of the wealth in the EU. There has also been a perception that countries with lower wages, with lower environmental standards, with lower taxes, have been taking business and jobs from people who are in the EU. The famous debate about delocalization. And then there are foreign companies and governments seen to engage in unfair practices, such as dumping and the whole debate that we have currently about steel and overcapacities for steel production, in particular in China, is an example of this. And then increasingly, people also associate globalization with migration flows. Now, let's get to the facts after the feelings. The facts are that globalization today means global value chains and specialization, where exchanges happen and value is added every time. This is a Volvo car, and you can see, well, you can't read it, but I mean, it gives you an impression that all the different parts in this car come from different places, and they are added and they create value, and the productivity of everybody increases because there is specialization on certain activities. Globalization also means, come to the next one, Spotify. 60 million subscribers and 140 million active users in 61 markets. Globalization also means cooperation and exchange of innovation, leading to a better diffusion of innovation, and also leading to the creation of, you know, the better understanding in the Christina type of approach. It leads to sharing ideas, cultures, experiences. The EU 27 is the world's largest trader, investor, and I underline that, development assistance provider. Every 1 billion of exports roughly creates 14,000 jobs. In 2016, exports supported roughly 24 million jobs in the EU. So that's for the facts. Now comes the forward focus. That's our forward focus champion, Cecilia Malmström. Katharina already described, this is our reflection paper on harnessing globalization. Now, harnessing globalization, where does that word harnessing come from? First, because there's no way back. We cannot stop globalization. Putting up the borders does not work. Protectionism does not protect. So what we have to do is ride the wave of globalization, but not as a purpose in itself, as a means. The objective is to project our values and interests through globalization. Social and environmental standards, trade interests, food safety, just to name a few. What we want to do is a race to the top. And how can Europe play that role? So harnessing means using as an opportunity, remember my first slide, rather than trying to avoid it, control it. Now, the question arises whether we are ready to harness. I want to pick out 5 points. Yes, we can. Yes, we can harness globalization because we have the blue wetsuit. We know what we talk about when it comes to successful regulated integration, because we've done it for a very long time inside the EU, and we know how it can function. The EU is a key G20 actor, and in that context we support global economy and a more global rule book to regulate different areas, including financial markets. When you look at the declaration of the G20 leaders in Hamburg from July, it's about sharing the benefits of globalization, creating trade and investment conditions, and abolishing imbalances worldwide. Another example where we've been very successful in creating rule books and momentum is the Paris Agreement on climate. Second point, yes, we can. Yes, we can contribute to UN, IMF, World Bank and WTO global order debates because we are the biggest trade bloc in the world. Our network of 139 EU delegations around the world equips us with a very powerful tool to connect with different nations on the ground and, for example, deliver our development assistance in a way that supports our values and interests. In summer this year, there was a broad agreement on a new consensus on development aid, which seeks not poverty alleviation, kind of curing the symptoms, but really going to the source and creating the conditions for nations to self-sustain and develop themselves. This new consensus, of course, is linked also to the migration issue, but there is a big shift, I observe now, within the EU development policy, but also beyond, in leveraging all the actors possible, but inside the countries, to develop the country. We also have the European Investment Bank. President Hoyer, in the context of some of the meetings, has alluded to the fact that the bank will propose a new focus inside the EIB family for development and external assistance. It's about leveraging also private investment. And when Prime Minister Löfven speaks in the UN Security Council, he of course also speaks and is seen as a European. Third point, yes, we can harness globalization because we can also defend ourselves. We are in the process of developing new rules and a new conscience on harmful tax evasion. By the beginning of next year, there will be a list of non-cooperating jurisdictions which we consider as not playing according to the rules and having harmful tax regimes. This is about developing an EU gold standard. It goes beyond what the OECD has developed, the famous BEPS context. And because we are a strong bloc, We hope that this EU gold standard would become the world gold standard. We are already in the different, for example, in the European Investment Bank, we are following in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, we are following these new standards, and this is spreading. Another example of probably the next global gold standard is our data protection rules. Our data protection rules are the first set of rules that tries to regulate and calibrate the data economy between the opportunities that it gives to companies and also the necessary protection of individual rights. As we are the first to do it, and it will start on 18 April next year, we're setting an example. And when President Juncker recently, 2 weeks ago, was in India, the Prime Minister asked him to help India to look at a comparable system, because the Indian highest court also followed the legislation and on the protection of privacy standards. Gold standard. Also on IP and standard setting, the process of standard setting, technical standard setting, the EU example is much admired around the world and often copied. Part of the IP, our IP system, for example, is copied by China. And they're constantly seeking also our advice on this. And our standard setting system, which is unique, one standard for a whole block of countries, is also being copied increasingly. The new trade defense instruments are championed by Cecilia Malmström. We also want to screen foreign investment in the EU in a more coherent way, because our partners, they do have investment screening systems. US, Japan, China, India, you name them. And 12 of our member states have these systems, but they function in a very different way and in very different, they are not very coordinated. So what we've proposed is to have the European interest also filtered through the different systems. And the last point, yes, we can harness globalization. It's because the EU, because member states, regions and towns and cities can focus on empowering citizens through robust social policies, through education, through training. We can focus, and Sweden is very good at that, on innovation, on digitization, social innovation, decarbonization, ease of doing business. We have a number of policies inside the EU, single market, digital single market, Innovation Horizon 2020, that strengthen every single company, I mean, they're almost, and citizens to be ready to harness globalization. And of course, we have the European semester, which is more core business in the DG that I'm working at, of helping, of X-raying member states every year if there are imbalances in the economic policy, if there is, if they are getting ready to be fitter to sustain competitive global markets and to sustain also our export model. So 5 times, yes, we can harness. In conclusion, I'd like you to take away 2 or 3 things. One is trade openness is not an objective in itself, it's a means. The real objective is to project our values, which are pretty unique, and our trade interests. The next takeaway is we need a holistic policy vision for the EU and think global beyond only trade. We need to include global governance, the IMF debates currently taking place. We need to include development, help to help yourself, the new consensus, investment, economic diplomacy, and domestic resilience. As you've understood, I'm an unconditional fan of Queen Christina, so I end with a quote. We should never believe in anything we do not dare to doubt. Please, in the subsequent discussion, express your doubts. Thank you very much. Tack så mycket.
Thank you very much, Kerstin, and we look forward to hearing more from you because you will be in the panel.
Thank you.
So thanks very much for this presentation of the Commission's thinking behind this.
Mute.
Okay, so I'll start again. Thank you very much, Kerstin, for your presentation. And you will be back in a moment in the panel, so we will have a chance to have a dialogue with you. But before that, I will ask Oskar Stenström to present some Swedish views on the issue and on the reflection paper. Please, Oskar.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I'm more lucky. I seems to be more lucky. So Kerstin, then I need to challenge you on a person too. See if you get this. This is a tough one. He was born 1907. He visited Denmark once. He went to Copenhagen and then he came home and said, no, Denmark was nothing for me, nothing to see. He went to Stockholm once with his son during the World Cup in the soccer. And that was the first time he actually saw an African guy. And I think his son is watching right now. That's my father. So my grandfather went to Denmark once. He never held a Swedish passport because we had the passport union. We enjoyed the free movement in Sweden during that time. But the best place to live in was in Skövde. He turned 94 years old. He never ate vegetables and never fish. He was a brick builder. And I say this because I think we should be very humble when we talk about globalization, that this has been a very fast process. In 2 generations, he has a grandchild, which is me, which has visited more than 100 countries and speak a lot of more languages than he does. But he lived a very good life in Skövde. But that photo when he went to Stockholm once, I mean, it's remember in the Swedish history we took the silver medal in the World Cup. Against Brazil, 5-2 at Stockholm Stadium, is very famous because he took a photo, and that was the first photo in my family where there was a African guy on the photo. And he was born 1907. Sweden was 5 million inhabitants. We have doubled that now. The speed of migration, the speed of globalization is immense. And that's put a huge challenge of us and you who are policy makers and following debate on globalization, because this is not the speed of light, because I'm studying Master of Engineering, so I know that that's a little bit faster, but it's going really, really fast in right now in politics. So thank you very much for organizing this this seminar, bringing up the topic. We can feel that the debate is heating up in Sweden, which is good. So best regard from my minister, who is in Oman today, trying to grab the growth there, coming back to that part of globalization soon. But Sweden is in a very good position right now to tackle this debate, because things is moving in the right directions. Growth is incredibly good, more than 3%. Employment rate is rising rapidly and is now the highest in 25 years, and unemployment is decreasing. And Sweden has never been more globalized, far more globalized than when my grandfather was born. We have all-time high figures for each month during 2017 in trade, export and import. Has never been higher. But at the same time, it's not that high compared to where we were actually before the financial crisis. So Europe is back, but not much higher than we were actually 2007, 2008. So there's more potential to grasp. And we are a very exporting dependent country, like many of the other EU fellow member states as well. We trade 71% of our export goes to the single market. So it's a crucial importance for us that the single market is delivering and is enhancing, especially in the field of digitalization. For the Spotify, I used to show the XC90 model. The V40 is a small car. We like big cars in Sweden, like my grandfather. And I have told that in the informal FAC trade meetings now 4 times in a row. If you buy an XC90, you buy 10,000 major parts from 98 different countries. So what should I write as a trade representative? Made in. I can't say made in Sweden, because that's how our trade rules are made up right now, that you have the rule of origin. So we have to adapt actually how the market is performing right now. So we need a better single market, but we also need more free trade arrangement, because we know that the growth is not happening within the single market the coming years. More than 50% of the global growth will be created in Asia, in the Middle East, and that's why my boss is in Oman today. And the results of globalization speaks for itself. Over the past 25 years, world trade as a share of global GDP has increased from less than 40% to almost 60%, which is also shown in your reflection paper. And foreign direct investment increased from less than 10% to just over 30%. And this is creating a good interdependency between countries. And this is the soft power that we should use more, because trade is a very forceful tool. And Sweden, as you said, is one of the most competitive countries. And the explanations are many in Sweden in our economic and political history. Openness to international cooperation, structural reforms, innovation and trade, and also security. We're talking here today when it's the UN Day. That's why we have flags on all the buses. And there is a positive agreement on trade between the trade unions and different stakeholders in our society, and the industry and the business. That makes me proud, and Sweden and Scandinavia a bit unique. And that's something we actually have to talk more about in the European Union. How we actually can foster an environment which is pro-free trade and pro-globalization, and to combat and harness the things that is not good enough. This is our bridges. And when I'm looking at statistics, the same as you showed, but you break them down, I think Pew Institute made a good one, which can be Googled. You see that the support for globalization in countries like the Netherlands and Sweden, 72-71% in favor, but at the same time, Greece, Italy, 44-35. So it's a huge split within our union. So cross-border and long tradition of free trade has been seen as an opportunity for companies, society and our citizens. That's why Sweden can be a clear free trade voice within the EU and an active partner in WTO. One of the key trade policy priorities for the government is that EU now concludes new bilateral free trade arrangements complementing the WTO. We have ongoing negotiations with Indonesia, Mercosur, Mexico, and hope to conclude Japan. We'd like to start new one with Australia, New Zealand, updating with Chile. We will put forward our bill on CETA in less than a month, or almost exactly a month, to the Parliament. Sweden supports the new ambitious free trade arrangement with regulatory cooperation, investment protection, public procurement, cooperation on environmental and health-related issues. And we know that we are stronger together, and that's why we need the European Union. We have doubled our populations from 5 to 10, but we are only 10 million inhabitants. And I can see when I go around now for 3 years how important EU is on the global trade and the global innovation arena because of our size. And that's what makes me sorry with the Brexit. So we need EU, and that's our opportunity to be the standard makers for the future on environmental standards, labor market standards, instead of being standard takers. And that was one of the best arguments for actually going forward with the TTIP arrangement, which is now very, very cold down in the freezer. And that's why we need a strong support for the European Union in Sweden and in all member states. And EU should work fine and do the right things. And since Sweden entered the European Union 22 years ago, the support for the membership has gradually increased, but it was not very strong from the beginning. And me and my grandfather voted actually no. And we were only in favor of the European Union, or EG, for a couple of weeks. And then the support went down again. It was low. Niels knows this. He was nicking. I think we were on the same side then. And then I was also on the other side during the monetary union. But the support for the European Union actually increased a lot in the beginning of the 21st century. And that was during a time when the European Union was delivering things that we like. Enlargement, enhancing democracy, expanding the single markets, turning former Soviet Union members into democracies, and that EU also had a role pushing for peace around the globe. Göran Persson going to North Korea, maybe he met some of the Kims, we don't know, but we made some difference. We went to the Middle East. And this is the things that we would like to see EU deliver. And we appreciated that moment. And we were also president of the European Union for the first time, 2001. And we were focusing on the 3 E's. I remember serving Anna Lindh that time: enlargement, employment, and environment. And that's still very much in the heart of the Swedes, and we would like EU to deliver. But of course, another more recent explanation for the strong support of the EU membership in Sweden is Brexit, and the debate which came and are going on after Brexit. Last year, 56% of Swedish citizens said that it would be a bad idea to leave the European Union, and that was the highest level since 2010. Sweden is also the country where most citizens believe that their voice is actually counted, both at the national level and at EU level. While the effects of Brexit will of course be overwhelmingly negative, I believe that it has made Swedes and other EU citizens that realize the extent to which we benefit from our membership of the Union. And that's the healthy debate that we are like to carry on. At the global level, the economic growth is more broad-based across countries and regions. It's important to take advantage of more favorable conditions to tackle key challenges and build resilience. The near-term outlook looks much better right now. Recovery is not complete and countries to be uneven, and the growth continues to be uneven between countries. Persistently low inflation, potential rollbacks in financial regulations, inward-looking policies and geopolitical tensions are some of the notable risks we face, and the growing protectionism hearing from also very huge countries on earth. Strong multilateral collaborations on these issues will be necessary to address them, speaking on the day of the UN. Moreover, as the gaps increase, confidence in cooperation and political solutions is eradicated. Instead, fear of globalization and the fear of migration and crime grows. And we can see that in Sweden too. And it's likely to create a breeding ground for xenophobia and extremism. Many people now experience that changes are not actually improvement. On the contrary, a lot of people experience that change is actually bad. And I would like you to Google one of the best reports that's more than 1 year old now, and that's from the McKinsey Global Institute. Its name is Poorer Than the Parents. And that shows very blunt what's happening with globalization the last 20 years. And you divide this 20 years into 2 phases. You take 1993 to 2005, 98% were on the track. Everyone was on board. So when growth was happening, their income was also increasing. It was only 2% who had a flat or falling income. 2%. Then, of course, we had the financial crisis. So between 2005 and 2015, the same figures for the richest OECD countries are 65 to 70%. So 65 to 70% has had a flat or falling income. So change hasn't produced anything good in their families. And if you break that figure up into countries in the European Union, you see Italy is over 90%. It's hard to run a policy of embracing globalization and push for change when less than 10% has actually gained. The same figure in Sweden is 20%. It coincides actually with the support of one of the major populistic parties in Sweden. That's not rocket science. And I think 20% is far too high, but it's a huge difference from Italy's 90%. Poorer Than the Parents is really putting the figures and the infographics, which is so deadly important for the Twitter flow in modern days. And it's still valid, even it's a little bit more than a year ago old right now. So people, of course, see that their work is being affected by global competition and the technology development, and thus perceive that their life situation is really being threatened and the future of their child's prosperity. It's important to understand that this reality exists and that the force behind it is really, really strong. And we feel it every day, and we look at it every day. Inequality has increased. Workers, and especially those with less qualified professions, get an even smaller proportion of the benefit. And there are huge regional differences. I spend a lot of time looking at the French presidential elections and see how divided France is and was. And that makes me afraid. And that was the same if you go into and check the split in the Brexit results, and also the support for political parties in Sweden. In many ways, I believe that populist and nationalist wave has been created because both national governments and the EU has failed to deliver enough, and particularly fast enough. Everybody has not been able to benefit from increased growth. Instead, the gaps has grown. And when people feel their situation getting worse, they go for alternatives, for quick solutions, and they like to find scapegoats. There is no way to ignore this. On the contrary, the government is determined to try to do something about the problems. We're working for an EU where growth and the social progress is going hand in hand. So finally, the Swedish government is pushing for the member state to strengthen the conditions for inclusive growth, increased investments in people, the implementation of structural reforms that facilitate conversion and provides a good balance between flexibility and security in the labor market. And we think that we actually have a pretty nice balance in our country, which works fine for Sweden. Social security system, labor market policies and education systems are really national affairs and should also be so in the future. I saw some debate articles yesterday from the Enterprise Confederation being afraid that the social pillar will mix this up. But that's a clear answer from the government. This is national affairs. At the same time, we have a lot to gain from comparing and learning from each other and coordinating our national systems in a way that promotes the mobility of EU citizens, workers, and self-employed workers, because we will move back and forth, even to countries like Denmark in the future. And then we need this conversion on the social systems. In the spring, the Commission presented the social pillar. We see some progress yesterday. We're happy about them. We see the pillar as an opportunity for common political commitments that can contribute to positive development across the EU, not least in member states with weak social security networks. And I'm dead sure that this also will increase the appetite eventually to globalization and to more of the free trade arrangements. So, finally, social summit in Göteborg, the best part of Sweden, the west coast. While there is a wealth of good practice in Europe, shaping the future and delivering fair jobs and growth to all through political dialogue and cooperation will not be less demanding in the years ahead. So as a part of this work, my Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, will host the Social Summit in Göteborg on November 17 on fair jobs and growth. The summit will be an opportunity to discuss on the highest level how we can promote and create the best conditions. An EU with a well-functioning single market, free movement, fair jobs, which can contribute to high employment and growth, and where we can equip us for the challenges and learning from each other about these gaps. It's not about moving more power to the European Union for us or deciding on the EU legislation. Instead, we hope that summit enables an exchange of experiences and increased understanding on different perspectives. So all of you warmly welcome to Göteborg later on in November. And I also should make a final pitch that the Prime Minister is having his EU speech, the State of the Union, and it's called Our Europe, Our Common Responsibility on Thursday. And that's where we will outline the government's EU visions for the years to come in front of the EU summit, and also to give more food for thoughts in these debates. And we would like, from the EU Minister's office, to be open and not to be more specific than later on this year and the beginning of the next year before this summit in March, to allow the debate to flourish. We have started a lot of what we call EU sakråd. It's a coordination mechanism functioning between governmental bodies on new issues and on all the policy papers presented by the Commission, which has been really good food for thoughts. And then we would like to consult with the Parliament and, in a very Swedish way, then come up with a common understanding how EU should work and what it should deliver for us. So thank you very much for the invitation, and hope you will have a good seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. If you could please hang on, stay on just a moment, if you don't mind. I would just have a couple of points here, and maybe we can have one or two questions from the audience also for you. So my question would be, in this European context that we are in here, you pointed a number of factors in Sweden that may explain why Sweden is perhaps harnessing globalization better and why support for globalization is higher. If you would point to one such factor, which would you mention as such a positive factor explaining this in the case of Sweden?
I think it's as simple as everyone has been on board, and all the region has been on board. But this is changing right now. The last 5 years we have had a Stockholm region which has had a growth rate of 30% more than the rest of the region. And that's good. I mean, Stockholm is competitive with many other big cities in the world and has to stay competitive. But we see that the gaps is increasingly. Until 1980, the whole Sweden actually developed in the same pace, and the gaps were fairly small in the society. So it was easy to push for open trade, also to push for migration. And I felt that coming from, you know this now, from Skövde, where we introduced a lot of migrations in the 80s and for the work permits, and then in the 90s with the war in Balkan, the first and the second. And as long as everyone was on board and the welfare was delivering, that actually kept the whole society together, the old society and the new one. So the poorer than the parents paradigm and the gaps and the income wealth in the society is crucial.
And going forward a bit, what do you see as the main challenge? Maybe it's what you just said now, but maybe more specifically, is there a particular challenge that you see for Sweden for staying on top of as much as possible on this, sort of riding the wave of globalization?
It's education, because we know that the society that we are now creating demands a lot of education. So when I go with my daughters to the school, you have to realize that they will spend now 17 years from the first time at the minimum to actually stay in this business and to make sure that everyone is on board. And if you go into this Pew Institute research, you see that this figures 20%, the dropouts, those who we don't equip, who can go to the second secondary school. I mean, those will be the vulnerable in the society. And we need to have a system for that too, to make sure that everyone is on board. And that leads us back to the gaps again. But the basic skills that we need is the primary education and the re-education for us, who has been in universities and then working for a while, and then we need to come back to the labor market. You know, there's an election in 1 year to come, so soon I will be back, maybe.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Oscar will not be able to stay throughout this seminar, so if there's one or two questions from you in the audience, this is your chance. If that's not the case, then I suggest that we thank Oscar very much for your
Put the hard questions to the panelists. Ola coming up.
So I would then we'll then move on to the first panel, and I will ask Kerstin to join us again, and in addition invite Eva Sjögren, who is director of SIEPS, the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies, to present your views on the reflection paper and perhaps also what previous speakers have said. So please, Eva, and let's call up Carl at the same time, so we'll have the full panel. Carl B. Hamilton, very well-known figure in this context. Professor in international economics, former member of parliament, and also advisor to Commissioner Cecilia Malmström. So welcome also to you, Carl. Again, so this panel will treat the European agenda of globalization. And again, I will ask Eva to give a first some initial remarks on what we have heard and on the reflection paper. Please, Eva.
Yes, thank you so much for the possibility to be here and to comment on the communication. And actually, I found your presentation very interesting, and actually I prefer some of your remarks to the communication. Well, I will come to this. First, I think it's very useful that you are so clear in your communication in pointing at the shared responsibility between the EU and member states. We've heard this. The EU has a strong role to play globally, at least, I mean, not the least through its trade agenda, but the member states, they do have a strong responsibility when it comes to redistribution among citizens, because here the EU has not really any powers. Perhaps slightly between member states, yes, but between citizens, no. So I think it's very important that you point this shared responsibility so clearly out in your communication, so that the EU, again, does not overpromise and underdeliver, this famous concept. Then to a few specific points in your communication. Also, I think it's good that you talk about benefits of globalization to consumers, because this is not something that it's not so, how should I put this, alive in the debate on globalization. Imports do provide consumers with a greater choice of products and also at lower prices. And this is something that people in general doesn't really see. So I think there's a need to put a stronger focus on this in the debate. And it is mentioned in your paper, but perhaps it could have exercised a bit more room. Then moving on, in your paper you're moving on to challenges of globalization. We've also heard about this. And there are some things in your communication that you present as facts, but in your presentation it was more presented as people's perception of things. And this idea of that competition leads to a downward pressure on income. There's a perception that that's the case, but in fact there's little evidence in research that there's a strong correlation here. It can be other causes of loss of income than actually competition from global companies. So I think it's important to divide between perceptions and facts, which I think you did that very good in your presentation. But I think perhaps the communication is a bit less clear on this. And also competition. In the communication, it is also a slight tendency that the idea of competition goes a bit far in the idea of that all competition is regarded as unfair trade practices. It is stated that competition from companies with higher productivity from outside, that can result in a situation that a factory closes down. And of course that is not a good thing for that factory or the workers working in that factory. But isn't that really competition? So to regard all competition as unfair practices, I think is a bit problematic. Then my final point, and that is exactly the same actually as your final point, and that's the idea of the future agenda for the EU, which is of course an ambitious trade agenda, but it's also this global standard setting. And I think it's interesting with this idea of EU as a normative power globally. And you can also reflect a bit on Sweden's, how we have acted within the EU. Since we entered the Union, we have exported Swedish norms into the internal market, for example, on environment, on animal protection. And in the same vein, it is important that the EU, with much stronger muscles than the Sweden alone, exports norms to the global market. So here I absolutely share your last point, and all this kind of standard setting globally goes beyond trade policy. Thanks. That was my comments.
Thank you very much, Eva. And then I leave to Carl to also to give some introductory remarks, reflections.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll concentrate more or less on one point, which is missing in the paper, but I think is absolutely crucial. And to be pedagogical, I will show this by talking about the United States to start with. Globalization means, as we heard before, increased differences in income and living standards, for example, in the United States. And we have this, you could say, debate about the situation in the US Rust Belt and the Trump victory in the election, which was because the people there felt that the situation, globalization, imports, destroyed their lives, and no one did anything about it, but Donald Trump promised to stop the imports, and then the problems would be, well, go away perhaps even. But I think it's very important not to import all that story to Europe, because there are an important difference, and it should perhaps be even bigger. We have a different policy response in Europe, especially in the Nordic countries. You could say that the United States is taking globalization on the cheap. If you get unemployed in the United States in the Rust Belt, the advice is that pull up your socks, move on to another state, somewhere else, and make sure that you get a job there. And you can only get support, income support, and perhaps some training, if you can prove that your unemployment is because of increased imports, that it's trade related. And that whole legal structure that you have to prove, or your trade union has to prove that it's import that destroys your job, of course creates an anti-trade sentiment in the country and in the media. So we should be very careful not to blame trade for everything that has to do with unemployment, because as American studies have shown, and I'm sure it's very similar here in Europe, 85 or 90% of all job losses are due to technical change, or that preferences have changed. The buyers don't want to buy the old goods anymore. Now, in Northern Europe, we have, unlike the United States, an active labor market, and that goes with both income support and training, retraining. And I think that should be discussed much more in the European Union. If one wants to stop the fear of globalization, you have to give people, the voters, an alternative. Not just tell them, pull up your socks and leave and go somewhere else. You have to have a social safety net. And that with social safety net is not just income support and training. It's also Obamacare in the United States. That's part of that. So I think it is globalization. If you want to have a stable, continuous globalization being accepted, you have to combine that with social safety nets for those risking their jobs, training, and perhaps even a compulsory retraining. No one should be allowed just to sit passively at home and collect some support. And if we don't succeed in that, I think that globalization will very easily become unpopular and lose the support of the voters, as we have seen in some countries. So we should protect individuals, we should protect people, we should not protect jobs. That is my basic message. Do I have more time?
A little bit, yes.
A little bit, okay. I think that is one or two other things. And as you and also Oscar pointed out, these global value chains, that you split up the production of a car in different parts, and the countries don't have comparative advantage in different goods anymore. They have comparative advantage in different parts of this global value chain. And that is an enormous benefit for developing countries. They don't have to have the capacity to produce a whole car. They only need to be able to do 1 or 2, 3 parts. And then they can enter the world market. The East European countries have, of course, benefited enormously from this when they became members of the European Union. Free access and a secure framework, legal framework, because as EU members and various aspects of this security. And that is what we need to try and develop and help in a slightly different way these days, namely Middle East, North Africa, that region which exports, if you like, people to Europe. I'm sure that those who come from these countries and try to cross the Mediterranean rather would stay home if they got a job at home. So we need to think about our trade policy also so that it stimulates production in these areas and that they will be allowed to sell to our country, or to Europe, I should say. That is all right with manufacturers. Most manufacturers enter more or less free of any tariffs and so on, but agriculture is not. And North Africa, there they can produce agriculture products for Europe, and that is not taken up. That link between trade and migration in your paper, not in the way I did anyway. But you really have to be concrete. You have to say, how are people going to live in the Middle East? They need two things. They need a stable environment, legal and economic environment. And the second one is that they need to be able to reach the markets where the consumers are, the buyers are.
If I just may make a bracket
yes,
on that,
of course.
there are 5,000 new Egyptians every month. And that gives you an idea. And there are by far not enough schools
and what
to
is
train
your
them.
what is your conclusion from that?
The conclusion is that we changed the consensus on development, that we created a European...
Who are we?
The EU.
Yeah.
And the EU, all the member states, and we dedicate our development money in a different way. Now we foster building schools,
yes, but
preparing
let me ask
for the
you
future.
Then, if we develop agriculture in Egypt, where are they going to sell it?
Of course, I mean that's a very tough point. Tomatoes from Morocco, but they're already coming into the EU. I mean, just to be very concrete, the port in between Spain and Morocco, there are there's a competition, but we have to make it a win-win for all. But the focus now, and we've just adopted the European Fund for Sustainable Development, which we will use by leveraging private capital also from the countries to develop in the countries the jobs and the opportunities for people to stay and win their living in these countries.
Okay. Well, I just want to underline that we are now in a situation where in 10 years' time there is 8 billion people in the world, and perhaps 5 or 6% of these are from Europe, are Europeans. So I mean, it's a completely different situation from the one which, so to say, have formulated our view of migration and asylum seekers, etc., namely the first 5 years after the Second World War. It's a completely different. And of these 8 billion people, of course, a vast majority are much poorer than people in Europe.
Thank you. Here, I'll let you in, Kerstin, just if you had reactions to what the other panelists said, if you like.
Yeah, well, I'd like to highlight that we have this more integrated concept of globalization, where we use our different tools, not trade to trade with whomever we want to trade, and development policy for the others. It's now being pulled together. Also because for the first time institutionally we actually have a tool, which is the European External Action Service with the 139 delegations. We have people on the ground, and I mean, I'm championing this today, which is the 17 development goals, and the 17 development goals, they also require not only public intervention, they also private intervention. And now the EU has equipped itself with a guarantee fund, which is new, which is not giving 100% of grants to the countries, but leveraging co-financing and investment. And the purpose is to create jobs and to create the necessary reforms. If I come back to Egypt, 5,000 new Egyptians every month. Where do they go to school? There are not enough schools. And the schools, if they are lucky and get a place in the school, they learn to be a civil servant. They don't learn to be an entrepreneur. So we are using the money now to build that capacity to create their own jobs. So there is a shift. I take your point. One day when they produce, they'll have to find their place on the world market for their products as well. But we have our neighborhood policy, we have the ACP countries where we have preferential trade deals. So it's all coming together. This is the important thing now. I think it's all coming together in the policy and the European outreach to our partners around the globe.
Thank you. So I think from what we have been discussing so far, we agreed that there is an issue of increasing inequality and less of support for globalization. So we have been referring to the European Pillar of Social Rights here. So I will turn to Eva and to Carl to see if you could comment on this as a means of reinforcing the safety net at the European level as a means of improving the situation. Maybe Eva first.
Well, I think as I began my intervention, this division of labor, and I think that is also quite clear in the pillar, that everyone in the EU, we are in this together, and if the member state does not take the responsibility seriously to look at inequalities in their societies, probably the acceptance not only of globalization but perhaps also the EU will fall. So the EU will not work if the member states do not take the responsibility nationally. And I think that is what the social pillar is trying to pinpoint and to bring this up to a political discussion. So that would be my comment.
Carl, how should the EU member states learn from each other or work together on this safety net that you referred to in your remarks?
Yes, I think that here we are beginning to face a very difficult issue for Sweden. I mean, you could say that the whole development in the European Union is problematic for Sweden with Brexit and so on, and the balance is tipping. But we have had, and I have been defending that in Parliament many, many times, that we should have education as a national policy. We should not. We heard Oskar Stenström talk about that. We mustn't let others decide anything in Sweden. Now, if we take the view, which I do now, as I said before, is that if we are going to be able to handle globalization, we need a social safety net, but also training, retraining facilities, and money being spent on that. And perhaps we need to have that partly as an EU policy, because we want to force, if you like, not only people but also other countries to spend money on education and, well, I should say retraining, because it's really that, to make the labor market function under competition. I just want to open up that possibility that we need to work on this issue together more, so to stimulate each other, but also perhaps in the end force each other, so that not part of the European Union becomes a kind of backwater, rust belts. We don't want that development. We have rust belts in Europe, in northern France and in the UK, and some other places, I'm sure. But should we accept that? Should we enforce policies that prevents rust belts from, well, remaining? Is that just a national responsibility? Well, I'm not so sure.
What do you say, Kerstin?
Yeah, that's very interesting what you say. There's of course EU policy, then there is the enforcement of EU policy, and then there is financing. And we built the single market by making EU rules and enforcing them. And that has created a kind of backlash because member states don't like it. And they put a lot of energy in defending when we enforce. Then we've moved on to develop more cooperative systems, and I would quote the European semester as being one. It's member states' responsibilities, but we X-ray every year, we present what we find, and we make recommendations to member states to implement them. Now for Sweden, our recommendation has been over years, address the housing situation. And Sweden has not addressed it. So you see the limits of it. What we're discussing... Huh?
Some in Sweden have addressed it.
What we're looking at now is for the new EU budget to find another means, which would be incentivize by offering money. Structural reforms, very important reforms. Member states, they don't always pick up the political energy. And it's, if it's an unpopular reform, it might damage your election prospects, so you prefer not to do it. And therefore, we are thinking now, in the next budget, maybe to provide a pot of money to give to member states, and we say, you can have this money, and you spend it as you think important, but only if you've done your reform. The structural reform or the kind of build the safety net that's required. That's an open discussion. That's an idea which is in one of the 5 other reflection papers when it comes, which is about the budget of the EU. But I think the enforcing part with 27 member states and clear national kind of policy responsibility is not so easy. And we have to be very imaginative and creative about this, and you will find it kind of looking out of some of the reflection papers about different policy areas. And as I said, the money part, because the next budget the UK is leaving will be smaller. So what do we spend this money on? And how do we spend the money? That's a very open question. Should we spend more on the incentive part? I hope this will be discussed further in your discussions on the future of the EU.
Indeed. Eva, okay. So at this point, our time is running out for this panel, but I would now like to let the audience in. There will be a microphone moving around here, so if you could raise your hand if you wish to intervene. And then perhaps mention who you are, please.
My name is Margareta Hidelius, and I would like to ask Kerstin, does the European Union embrace the development of gender equality as a global and not only a national stand?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Our president, 2 weeks ago, was Girls Can Day, Global Girls Day, and our vice president, Mr. Timmermans, first vice president, had a girl taking over his job for a day. I don't know if Swedish politicians did that as well. In Finland, they certainly did. And that's a very important issue for us also to project beyond the EU. And I think we're very. It's another gold standard we're presenting here, and it's certainly part of it, of the projection of our values.
Okay, so we have just on the other side.
Mats Hellström is my name. On the question on globalization's effects in the United States and Europe, it's often said that the US has come out better than Europe after the financial crisis. The Danish former Secretary of State, Örström Møller, later ambassador in Singapore, sitting now in Singapore looking at the rest of the world, he has a following argument. It's completely wrong that the US has come out better. The US had a federal system where money goes to the poor states directly, but they still will be poor. there is no incentive for structural change. In the European Union, the tough programs on Greece and other countries in the south of Europe has been provided with the provision of structural change. And the productivity is increasing in southern Europe. So in that sense, Ostermöller means that Europe deals with globalization in a more grown-up way than the United States. And I certainly agree with that. I would like to listen to your comments as you are discussing now the responsibilities of national states and the European Union.
I'm not sure that I can reply fully to your question, but I have been struck by the fact that the support in the labour market, as I discussed before, is a federal policy. Although, in many cases, you would wonder why don't the individual states, so say, pull up their socks and help their citizens in their states. But that seems to be almost absent in the United States. So there is something in their system which is very problematic here. That is, first of all, that it's only a federal policy, but the second one is that, of course, in the United States, the Republicans are the free trade party, or they used to be. But that was not supplemented by any will of supporting people who lose their jobs because of globalization, and areas which become more or less desolate because of globalization, or import competition, I should say. So that's why I say it's a globalization on the cheap. I mean, I think if you really want to have a globalization, you need also to have some domestic policies which follow up what happens in the labor market and regionally and so on. And that, I think Europe is better in that respect, much better, although the motives for these policies in Europe may not be globalization primarily, but rather that win the next election and so on. But democracy is not so bad. That was a rather poor answer, but it's what I can produce right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that provides a good bridge to the next panel that will be led by our co-organizer Forrest and Andreas Bergström. So I will invite him and his panel up. But let's give this panel a hand for this.
Please.
I think the US system is a reinsurance system. The federal state only steps in once the whatever exists at national level has failed. I can organize if you want. I give you my card afterwards. It's behind the...
Okay, let's see if we get any sound here. Okay, I think you can hear me right now. Okay, thank you. My name is Andreas Bergström, and I am the Deputy Director at Forest, the Green and Liberal think tank. It's connected to the ALDE group in the European Parliament, and we work a lot on economic issues, climate, migration and integration, and also digital issues. With me today I have a very nice panel. It struck me that it became an all-male panel. We reshuffled a bit here, so it was a bit unfortunate, but at the same time it's a very good panel, so I'm very happy with having you here. I'm not happy with myself, perhaps, not noticing this earlier and doing something about it. Anyway, this is Ola Pettersson. You are the chief economist at LO, the big biggest trade union in Sweden, of course, and Per Altenberg, senior advisor at the National Board of Trade, and Andreas Hatzigeorgiou, chief economist at the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. And I've seen who's on the list for today. It's a lot of people here from the government offices. I know a lot of people here are actually experts when it comes to trade. There are a lot of people here from from different parts of the government offices. So I think we will allow ourselves to be a bit technical, but we will also, I think, talk about the bigger issue here. Ola was a bit worried here before that it was. I sent out very technical issues before, very technical questions. So we'll do a bit of both, hopefully. And after this, Kerstin Jorna will sort of sum up the whole seminar. So if we start actually with the big issue. Is your picture, I mean, there's definitely a discussion right now that globalization, that's a lot of people are now worried about globalization, a lot of people are worried about losing their jobs and so on. Ever since the financial crisis in 2008, there's been like a backlash. Is this more of a media hype, or is actually something happening here? We've seen trade sort of, it has plateaued, you could say, trade compared to world GDP. So what's your picture? Is it something, is this like sort of short thing and we'll start, and trade will start growing again, or is this something completely new? Who would like to start? Ola.
I think we have to recognize that something very important has changed, and that is the fact that the main guarantor and the designer of, let's call it, our present international or global system, the United States, this whole setup is of course questioned by the present administration. I think that's quite a huge change, and that has to be realized. So something's afoot.
Andreas?
I think we are experiencing a backlash against globalization. If we look at specific trade barriers around the world, I think the European Commission, and I want to take the opportunity also to thank the European Commission for this reflection paper and also all the good work that you're doing now, looking at how Europe and the European Union can develop in these stressing times. But coming back to the issue whether we are experiencing, in fact, a backlash to globalization, the European Commission's monitoring report clearly indicates that there's a rise in the number of trade barriers facing European companies. I think the exact number is around 10% increase in trade barriers last year. So we are experiencing a backlash against globalization. Is this something to be upset about? Yes, I think. Is it uncommon that we have backlashes against globalization and openness after economic crisis? The answer is no. We've had this thing going on every time, every phase of economic downturns. We always get into a phase of sort of criticism against openness and globalization. We had this in 2000 in Seattle. We had this during the 70s. We had this during and after the two world wars, a phase sort of following economic downturns. You have a backlash against globalization. Kerstin pointed out that Sweden and the opinion in Sweden is rather in favor of globalization. You mentioned, I think, 60% of Swedes think that globalization is something good. From my point of view, I was sort of shocked that the number was so low. 76%. But anyways, 76%. I would just like to ask the audience, raise your hand if you own a smartphone of the brand iPhone, Apple's iPhone, or Samsung. Raise your hand. So that's 100% of the room, basically. So, 100% of this room reaps the benefits of globalization. Still, you only have slightly more than half of Europeans thinking that globalization is good. That's a low number.
Interesting. Pi?
Can you hear me? Islam. I think I'm supposed to be the technical guy here, so I'll present you with a paper or a report that we wrote that's called Protectionism in the 21st Century. And to answer your question, yes, we are concerned that there is now a growing protectionism in the world. And more specifically, what I would like to talk a little bit about that we've not talked about yet here is, on the one hand, we have all these tariffs, and they tend to level out at this point from around the mid-2000s, 2005 or something, and they stay at the same level, right? But what is now on the rise are all these non-tariff measures. They're rising pretty quickly, and when I speak about them here, I don't mean all the technical regulation or safety standards and all that we need in a society. I mean discriminatory measures, such as, for example, subsidies or localization barriers or discriminatory requirements in government procurement, and even recently, for example, anti-dumping and trade defense measures. So these are the biggest problems right now. And why are they a problem? Well, the reason is that they are associated, originally the GATT founding members, they were very conscious that they didn't only want to reduce trade barriers, they also wanted the trade barriers that are there to be transparent and non-discretionary. And the new non-tariff measures are discretionary. They're not posted in advance, you know exactly what you're going to pay at the border, and then you can export. Instead, there is a civil servant sitting somewhere, and he or she decides on whether you can export. So all of this basically introduces more uncertainty in the system. And perhaps that is also why, as Andreas mentioned before, the trade is now plateauing or even decreasing a little bit in relation to GDP.
Interesting. But I think we can see several different things here, because we see definitely a trend that we try to see different sort of trade barriers. Maybe you find some excuse to have some rule, but you also see, I think, legitimate concerns for like social dumping, environmental dumping, and so on. How is there a way to balance this? I mean, I don't know how you actually, if you looked into this in your report, is there any way actually to make a difference between something that is quite legitimate to worry about social dumping or environmental dumping, or something that is actually an excuse to keep competition out?
I mean, when we talk about dumping in this context, it's actually not about environmental dumping, it's not about social dumping, it's about dumping prices, so it's economic dumping, basically. And there, I mean, the option there is to have alternative measures, such as competition policy, etc. When you speak about environmental dumping and so forth, well, I think we need global governance here, right? So when I look at the Kerstin's paper, what I think is really important here is that when we talk about reciprocity and a level playing field and so forth, we need to achieve all this in a negotiating context. But if you look at the paper on an abstract level, it's very balanced, I think. But when you go into the details, then it's all about the unilateral actions by the EU. And I think it's much more effective, and that's also the experience by the EU, as Kerstin pointed out, to negotiate these issues in a negotiating setting, right? So to go unilateral, in my mind, is not the way to go. We should try to maintain the multilateral agenda, and if we can't negotiate there, we should do it in free trade agreements or in RTAs then. It's a better avenue.
Ola, you have something of, not unique, I shouldn't say, but Swedish trade unions are quite pro-free trade compared to other trade unions around the world. How come, and do you think that this is something that will last in the future?
I think it is conditional in a sense, but I think we have a very long tradition of being pro-trade, being pro-structural change. But of course this has been in a setting where we have felt we have had very strong political support for measures that can make structural change and trade a win-win for very large segments of the population. And what, for example, Carl mentioned here earlier is that some countries have failed quite miserably in actually making enough people winners on globalization and on structural change, on changes in taste and technology, because all these are mixed up. Of course, this is not only a globalization story, but I think we have to be clear that, I mean, this of course can change. If conditions change, if we destroy unemployment insurance, if we destroy active labor market policy, of course people will, change their views on structural change. They will perceive the risks as being very different and change as being much more harmful. Mm-hmm. So I think the support is conditional.
One reflection, if I may, on the point of categorizing the arguments against trade and globalization, and that's the key issue, I think. So I agree with you, Andreas, on the difficulties in pinpointing what criticism is legit and what type of criticism is just scaremongering. And from my experience, working in trade policy and looking at these issues for quite a few years now, is that more and more of the arguments are actually being driven by scaremongering, and that globalization is actually acting as a punching bag against everything that's wrong in society. And Professor Hamilton was alluding to this as well. I mean, the majority of the job losses in the US during the past 2 decades has been about automation, but still people are protesting globalization, and they're voting to elect a president who's mainly anti-free trade. So you have a big discrepancy between what's actually a challenge to jobs, automation, digitalization, and what's really being criticized out there, which is globalization. And coming back to a point that was made by the Commission and also in the reflection paper on what the aim of trade should be for European trade policy, is that it should be a means to an end, and that it's not an end in itself. And I can say that I completely disagree with that argument, although the reflection paper overall is very good and it provides very interesting food for thought. I think that trade is, free trade and globalization and openness, is a means to an end, just like freedom of speech is, of course, an instrument to increase jobs, employment, innovation, and everything. Free trade is also about the freedom to choose between a Volvo and a Tesla, a freedom to choose between, US, New Zealand, or French wine. It's up to the individual. So it can be, and it should be, I think, an end in itself, which I think also would be good for the environment if people, instead of being forced to buy very dirty grown tomatoes from the Netherlands, instead can buy them from, Northern Africa, for instance.
Interesting. Ola, again.
I just want to state a point of agreement here with Andreas, that I think globalization to a very large extent is a scapegoat for mainly domestic policy failures. I think much of the inequality growth we've seen during the last decades in the OECD countries is homegrown, so to speak, and is the creation of policies made in those countries. So I think globalization has been given an unnecessarily bad rep, but it works. Apparently, it can make you president of the United States. So I think many will pick up on the idea.
Because that was my next question. Do you actually think, because I think in Europe we haven't so far seen, at least not on the European level, we haven't really seen the same things as in the US. But do you think we're heading that way? Is this something that sort of anti-trade sentiments, is this something that will be growing and that politicians will try to win elections on?
Well, just to look at the paper that we read for today, I'm a little bit concerned again that when we're talking on the general level, then it's very balanced. It's about both trade liberalization, trade negotiations, and the benefits of openness, and about the challenges. But then when we go into details, it's all in one direction. It's all about the new restrictions that we want to impose. So I want a more balanced agenda here. I think that would be very healthy to have also the trade negotiations, and also talk about how the rise of NTBs is a problem for good governance. It's a good governance issue that all the new peaks in non-tariff measures represent. So here we need a balance, and I think possibly this is a reflection of the sentiments that we have here in our societies.
Do you? No? Okay, just look that close. Okay, do you think we should talk a bit about China as well, I think, because that is often the example. Some countries claim that China, they have price dumping, they sell cheap shoes or whatever, out-competing Italian shoe companies, or they have such low social standards in China, and that's something. They have low environmental standards in China, and that's something we have to balance that in some way, because it's unfair competition. And it's also about investment, that Chinese companies in Europe, they can actually function quite freely in Europe, whereas European companies in China have a lot of restrictions. Is there a big problem here? I mean, this is actually, I think, apart from the shifting sentiments, this is like the more reasonable underpinning for changing rules and have more regulations in Europe. Is there something to it? Are there things we should do? Who wants to start?
Well, if I may start,
sure.
Then I wrote a book together with Peter Kleen here, the former Director General at Kommerskollegium. And in that book, about 10 years ago, we talked about the Mike Tyson argument. And the Mike Tyson argument was basically me or you being up in a boxing game against Mike Tyson. And the level playing field argument is about this, that we cannot compete with countries that have very low wages or low standards. The problem is that all the countries that we trade with, they see it exactly the same way. They think that they cannot compete with us because we're much too productive. So it goes both ways, basically. And right now at Kommerskollegium we have something called Trade Academy. It's education for civil servants, trade civil servants from a number of developing countries such as Zambia, Ecuador, Lebanon, Bangladesh, and Ukraine. And I can tell you that their sense is not that the playing field is tilted in their favor and against Europe. It's the opposite.
Andreas?
Well, I think that Zambia is not to be compared with China, although I see your argument, Per, but I think that we can't be naive when it comes to China. I mean, China is a big player. It's not a market taker. It's actually a market giant that affects the very fundamental premises upon which we compete in the global market. And I think the integration of China in the world economy has been hands down very positive. I mean, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty due to that. At the same time, we need to be clear on the fact that China is using to its advantage methods to compete in a market in a way that makes it difficult for our companies to compete. And China is not Zambia, or China is not a small country which has a lot of issues with, you know, getting their products to market. It's actually a company that competes with the very best of our companies in Europe. So I think it's good that the Commission, for instance, has opened a discussion on how we can look at Chinese investments in Europe, and it shouldn't be a way to sort of let protectionism within our system roam free. Absolutely not. But we need to figure out how we can deal with China's ambitions to increase its market share, but at the same time not play based on the same rules that European and US companies, for instance, have to play upon.
I would like to ask Ola before I let Karin again. How come LO isn't worried about the Chinese workers stealing the Swedish workers' jobs?
I don't think they have so far. I think that's the simple reason. I wish we had more studies on actually how this has played out in the Swedish labor market, but I would be very surprised if we had a case where, you know, on a more general level, Chinese workers stole Swedish workers' jobs. But if you look at the US, you of course have a different situation. There you now have quite a few studies actually looking into you know, regional labor markets and how they have been affected by Chinese competition and opening up to Chinese imports. And there you see quite strong effects. I hope we continue to uphold a kind of structures, policies, institutions that can make us deal with these changes also reaching Sweden without going into a more kind of negative view on the Chinese integration into global markets.
Why do you think this difference is there? Because in the US, there are actually studies both showing that automation is affecting the labor markets locally or regionally, and that trade is affecting the labor markets in a way that we don't really see in the EU. Actually, in the EU, we now have record high levels of employment. We have in Sweden, we have in Germany, in several countries, and in the EU as a whole. So we have quite different, I mean, we both trade with China, we both have automation, but we see quite different, it evolves in quite different ways. Is there some...
I mean, there seem to be some frictions in the US labor market which are very important, actually, but when someone loses a manufacturing job, that's to a large extent a devastating blow. It's almost impossible to reach the same income levels for a manufacturing worker in the US, while we don't see, you know, similar situation in perhaps Sweden in particular, but in Europe in general. So I think that's a very important explanation.
I think what it boils down to is that in Europe, especially in Northern Europe and countries like Sweden, we gave more simple manufacturing jobs to the robots before we gave them to the Chinese. So that's basically what's going on here. I mean, if you go to the US, you see employees everywhere. Go into a restaurant, you know, you have one person pouring the water, one person, you know, picking up the dishes, and there are people everywhere. We have simply made this structural shift towards a more effective labor market way before the US has. So now when China is taking further steps into the global market, that's going to be portrayed in a different way in the US as compared to in Sweden, for instance. But having said that, and having said that, we need to look at, you know, the mechanisms through which we can evaluate Chinese investments and all investments for that matter, without risking to hurt the ideas of free trade. I'm afraid also that Europe is making it more difficult to compete with China and other countries in the future. With all the regulations that European countries and at the European level are being imposed on the business communities in Europe, I'm afraid that we will end up in a situation where the US innovates, China plagiarizes, and Europe regulates. That's not going to be a winning solution for us.
We actually we've seen a trend in the last few years that sort of the citizens are not so impressed by globalization, but we still have new trade deals. So we have a new trade deal with Canada. We have a new trade deal with Japan. Is this some sort of discrepancy here? Is this a problem? Should we say that, well, the citizens will soon get back on track? They will soon realize again that globalization is actually something good for them? Or should the politicians perhaps listen more to the citizens?
I think actually policymakers need to be retrained in the latest generation of trade research, because what we hear today is a lot about the challenges and how jobs are outsourced and so forth. But in fact, the latest generation of trade research shows that there are much greater benefits from trade liberalization than we previously thought. Because it used to be all about Ricardo, all about comparative advantage and all that. That is not the new game in town. The new game in town is about how trade improves productivity within sectors and within firms. And that means that we have a rising productivity level for the whole of the economy that is beneficial through trade and trade liberalization. And I think this is a message that is very clear to me when I read recent trade research, but it has not been communicated well enough to policymakers, because I seldom hear it in situations like this. And still, it's a very clear message from about around 2005 and forward in trade research.
I just like to echo that. I completely agree. A lot of people need to be retrained, but we also need to actually realize that nations are not the natural hubs of international commerce anymore, or global commerce for that matter. I mean, cities are really the new leaders when it comes to international and global trade. McKinsey estimates that in 2025, 60% of global economic growth will be generated only by 600 cities. And we see this in Sweden as well. You know, the metro regions of the country are really the big drivers of global commerce. So we need to figure out how we can adjust and adopt old trade policies that were built and decided upon the old world of Ricardo. You know, you have one country or two countries trading one good with a reality where we have a multipolar world consisting mainly of global economic cities.
Yeah. As I said before, we have very good audience here. Lots of people actually working with these issues on a daily basis. So I would love to hear some questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, Nils, please.
Yes, it is common when we discuss what we're now discussing, European cooperation, that there is no discussion of the difficult problems. And one thing is that if we are now talking of globalization, what do we mean by it really? Everything? Or do we just mean trade in goods and services? Or do we take in private investment, international? Or do we take in migration? It should be free too, and so on. Now, these are the complications. I'm sure that if you ask people in Europe now, do you like globalization? It depends on if they think that what is now happening with migration, I hate it. If you say strictly free trade, in Sweden you get 90% or more, I'm sure about that. And I would like to hear about that. Another thing is that we always end up saying that we need the same sort of rules. Because there are people in the United Nations, in WTO, in Brussels and so on, who know, civil servants, they know the future and they know how we should arrange things. And most people don't believe in that. I don't either. And there is something we call institutional competition. The reason that some countries are doing quite well and others not at all, if you look at it, you find it's not because of natural resources and all that. It is because they have good institutions that work. And they have to be developed. If we have everything arranged from above, it's my view, you don't get this institutional competition, and then you stop development. You don't compete only in producing goods and services, but in producing institutions. What do you say about that?
That's actually two good questions. Let's take one at a time. Let's start with the first one. Globalization means a lot of things. I mean, we usually talk about the four freedoms in the EU. You can also talk about technology, you can talk about culture, ideas, and so on. So there's actually a lot of things that can be flowing freely between countries. And of course, in the US, trade has been something that you can scare people with. In the EU, it's perhaps more migration. Is there a link here? Is this perhaps what people are more worried about, migration? Is there a link between trade and migration, as was mentioned in the panel before? Who wants to comment on this? Ola?
I can try. I mean, I think it's a fair point Niels is making, that the critique against globalization has taken very different forms in the US and Europe. Whilst in the US it has focused on trade, in Europe it's much more about migration. Why that is the case, I'm not really sure. I think Danny Roderick has written very interestingly on that, and the fact that Europe has, more developed welfare states might explain why trade is less of an issue here, and also perhaps why migration is more of an issue. But I think I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
On the question of definition, I completely agree. I think that's a fair point as well. In my mind, when I talk about globalization, I can just speak for myself. I usually delimit myself to economic globalization, not social issues or culture or, the deterioration of European true culture due to external influences. That's a common, discussion on the continent of Europe. And an anecdote is in fact that when the European Union was negotiating the mandate to negotiate a free trade agreement or an economic partnership with the US, the French actually refused to include culture and audiovisual services within the free trade agreement mandate. So that's a big issue in some countries. For me, I usually talk about economic globalization, trade in goods and services, factor mobility, that is migration of workers, not refugees.
Yes, from the board's perspective, we talk about flow facilitation. So the problem here, of course, is that all these different things are intertwined. And let me take one example. We have Sandvik Tooling, which is a Swedish firm, and they export drilling equipment, right? But it's not just the product itself. They sell it in a package together with the different types of services. It's, of course, recycling services and maintenance services and insurance services and all these different types of things. And that in turn requires that they send out people to do the maintenance and the service and the training of that equipment when they sell it abroad. And also they need data to flow freely in order to monitor that equipment. So all these different flows in the economy are interrelated. But I agree with Andreas, at the Trade Board, of course, we deal with trade issues, but there are different types of flows in the economy, and we need to look at them all and not just trading goods.
Yeah. I would actually like to let Kerstin Jorna in now to sort of wrap it all up. So I would like to thank this panel. Thank you very much.
Tack så jättemycket. Trevligt.
And please.
Tack. Jättekul.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for a very good debate. I would have loved to show you a photo, and unfortunately I didn't find it, which is from 2 years ago. Our offices were attacked in Brussels by a group of animals coming out of the park, and who threw something like, I would say, 300 bags of garden waste into our lobby in the building, danced around it creatively, sprayed "No to TTIP" everywhere on the wall, and disappeared again. Now, why did they come? I was working in the single market department at the time. They came because on our door we still had, from the previous service, the thing which said Department for Trade, DG Trade. So they thought they had the right building. And I had to think of the photo when we discussed today, because how do we discuss, and I find this amazing, we discuss about feelings a lot today, about feelings, perceptions, before we got to the facts. And I've been in the business of the EU project for the last more than 20 years, and we tend to discuss facts and facts only. But you're right, it's time to turn it around and to look what actually is the perception and how we deal with that from there. Also your iPhone example, of course, that's the benefit of globalization. But then, is that really a benefit? Because what type of news do we watch on our iPhone? What kind of echo chambers do we live in? And I think that's part of the explanation also for the US election. So much for globalization and other sides of it. So one point is how we discuss. The other I find noteworthy is what we discussed. And first, there was globalization is an issue of redistribution. There was a lot of debate, in particular with Carl and Eva, on the fact that unless we make globalization in the perception of everybody an opportunity, we will not win this. And we have to work more on it. Be it, I mean, some argue this is for member states only. Carl, you said, well, the EU could also play their role. I think the debate we will have about the next 5 or 7 year budget for the EU will be a good place to discuss that as well, how much the EU can do to help this redistribution issue, not only when it comes to between member states, we have cohesion policy for that, but also when it comes to the individual, what we call structural reforms 2.0, the human skill, the individual competitiveness, if you want. The second globalization is point I retain is that globalization, the debate about, has to be holistic. It's not only trade. It's also about diplomacy. It's also about development. It's also about security. It was only mentioned very marginally. And then, I mean, you said it's even a right to choice. I'm not quite sure if I would agree to that, but I mean, this is the span how we can discuss about globalization. The third globalization is, I retain, it's like a marriage. In fact, you have to work every day because it's a multiple challenge. It's global, it's global institutions, it's within the EU, but it's also within member states, and it's within regions. It's also more about empowering and being able for everybody to use globalization as an opportunity than about controlling, regulating, as you said. We shouldn't be defensive about it, but we shouldn't be naive either. We should have the whole toolbox of different money, power, meaning, you know, being very clearly represented and identified as EU in international fora, having the good ideas, having the gold standards, having the right values, and using it in a smart way together. What do I take away to Brussels to feed back to my colleagues from this debate? Because all of this is like streams flowing back to Brussels and to when we develop the next steps in our policies. I see the long shadow of China. There is quite a debate how to engage defensively, proactively. In my own area, previous experiences, I had a very positive experience with engaging proactively on intellectual property rights and technical standards. And what I took away from that is, if we can convince our Chinese counterparts that this is a win-win situation, they will engage, and that gives us an opportunity to also influence. It does not always work. Sometimes there are setbacks, but I think it's we just have to hang in there and do that. And then the long shadow of automation. Of course, the effects that are often attributed to globalization mostly come from technological disruption, but that's not really well seen. But from different, and in particular what you said, is that the automation is for us an opportunity to enhance, to harness globalization rather than a threat. Globalization does not come with automation. We expand and have opportunities by using automation. And I just wanted to mention the two industrial new projects. One in Sweden, which is the battery factory, which is a big investment in the north of Sweden, and only robots, and it will create 3,000 jobs. And there's another example from Finland. I'm just looking, Uusi Kaupunki, car factory, only based on robots, and 4,000 new jobs. So there is a win-win to enhance, and we will not regulate it to death. On the contrary, we hope that the single market regulation that we have in the digital single market will empower and make these models possible. And the last point, I'd like to go back to be concrete also to the social pillar. One of the initiatives inside the social pillar is that we triggered a social partner dialogue on contracts, new forms of contracts for new forms of labor. For example, platform workers. What kind of contracts do we have here? And this is again to make Europe ready to engage with these new forms of ways to work and to turn that into an opportunity. This is so far as I've kind of noted my little takeaways. Thank you very much for the debate. Very much appreciated.
I'd like to thank you again for coming here. I'd like to thank the Commission for this interesting reflection paper that we've based this seminar on. And I'd like to thank the audience, both of you who had questions and the rest of you who have listened for 2 hours. So thank you all panelists, thank you Commission, thank you the audience, and thanks for today.